Hello and welcome to the 2021-2022 season of Town Hall Seattle's Civic Series. We have a spectacular lineup of events this season. If you'd like to attend a live or virtual event, go to our calendar at townhallseattle.org. To watch this program and view closed captioning, subscribe to our Town Hall Seattle YouTube channel. And now, on to our Town Hall Seattle Civics program.
Good evening. My name is Xin-Yi Pai, and I'm the Program Director at Town Hall. On behalf of the staff at Town Hall Seattle and our friends at Third Place Books, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's virtual presentation with Tom Standage, who will be in conversation with technology reporter Mark Harris. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Civics series is supported by Real Networks Foundation, True Brown Foundation, the Neshholm Family Foundation, and Wincote Foundation Northwest. Lastly, you'll want to dive deeper into this evening's topic by purchasing a copy of the author's book. Please use the link in the chat below to pick up your copy through Third Place Books. Tom Standage is deputy editor of The Economist and the author of 6 previous history books. His writing has also appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Wired, and other publications. Standage holds a degree in engineering and computer science from Oxford University. Mark Harris is an investigative technology reporter based in Seattle, writing regularly for The Guardian, Wired, MIT Technology Review, and TechCrunch. He has a special interest in transportation, breaking stories on giant airships, military drones, GPS attacks, and automated vehicles. Standage's new book, A Brief History of Motion, From the Wheel to the Car to What Comes Next, is the subject of this evening's discussion. Please join me in welcoming Tom Standage and Mark Harris.
Well, thanks for that great introduction, Xin-Yi. We're really glad to be here. So I'm Mark Harris. I'll be your interlocutor, just a moderator tonight to introduce our talk with Tom, which we'll get to in a second. But just to kind of summarize the book, normally this is the point in the presentation where I say, how many people got here today by walking and how many people took a bus and how many people took their car? And then we'll get a kind of a generic view of how we all move around the world. And as we know, here in America, a lot of us have to use the car. Of course, we are now in this virtual world. You can hear that somebody's walked up to my front door and rang my doorbell. In the virtual world, we still are incredibly reliant on transportation, not only for getting ourselves around, but for getting those packages and takeaway foods that come to our house for delivery. And it's always been an interest to me to think about how we got to where we are today. Why do cars look like they look? Why do we drive as any normal person drives on the left-hand side of the road? Why did all these Americans and why do people here in Seattle insist upon driving on the right-hand side of the road? Why are some highways going through poor neighborhoods? Why do some rich neighborhoods get really tree-lined avenues? And how is this transportation evolving as we get new technologies and understand new ways of living in our cities? So really, I want to get straight into the story and welcome Tom here who's joining us in the middle of the night from London. So feeling awake, Tom? Are you
Yeah, I have. I had a whole bottle of Coke, so I'm okay. Good to be here. Good to see you.
Let's just start with one of the chapters in the book that I really enjoyed. And it's one that really spoke to me because it has both a historical aspect and yet feels absolutely relevant to the life here today. And that's the chapter on ride hailing. And particularly this thing that is not new at all. I mean, the Uber we get today is by a long way not the first ride-hailing and shared transportation model we've got. But particularly, I think one that's really interesting, I think, to people here in America is going to be the jitney invasion. I've never even heard of this before. And it was 100 years ago, just 100 and a few years ago, where it kind of launched at an exponential rate. Shared transportation. Tell us a little bit about the jitney invasion and what we can learn from that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is one of the great stories that I came across while researching this book, because I think it's very interesting at the point where we are with looking at our transport systems today in cities and saying we could probably do things a bit better than this and be less reliant on cars. And so what can we learn from the past? And there are many of these stories that I think can be directly useful in shining light on how we can do things. In fact, even before this one, if we're talking about, the Ubers and the Lyfts and so on, one of my earlier examples of this is that when Hackney carriages are first introduced into London, so these are the first carriages that you can hail in the street, so basically taxis. This led to a massive backlash from the sort of incumbent providers of rides in London, who were the watermen who would row people up and down on the river, and that was how you used to get around in London. You'd hail a boat by the river and say, I want to go to London Bridge, or I want to go up to Westminster, and so they all complained, and they said all their profits were running away on wheels because these Hackney carriages had shown up, and that they sound exactly like black cab drivers or taxi drivers in other cities complaining about the arrival of Uber. But yes, the jitney is a very is more up to date story. But again, it has these sort of very direct parallels. So jitney is a slang for a nickel, and it used to cost a nickel to ride on streetcars, and so what we would call trams. But it was a flat fare, and this was because streetcars were very often built by real estate developers, and they would build housing developments on the edges of cities, and they would run streetcar lines out to them, and that would mean that the value of the property would go up because it would have fast access to the city centre. But the problem with the streetcars is because they're running on rails, they would quite often get stuck behind other traffic, particularly horse-drawn traffic, and so this rather interesting thing happened in Los Angeles starting in 1914, and this is a period of recession. Quite a lot of people are unemployed, but it's also the point. It's only 6 years after the introduction of the Ford Model T, and so it's a very reliable, very cheap car. So you've got this situation where you've got quite a lot of unemployed men who happen to own cars, and so one of them has this idea. He's driving along and he sees somebody waiting for a streetcar, and he pulls over and says, "I'll give you a ride, and I'll just charge you the usual nickel." So he's driving into the downtown district. So he takes this guy in his car and charges him the nickel, and he's going there anyway. So that was quite straightforward. And then he realizes, well, hang on a minute, I could do more of this. So he ends up driving up and down the streetcar line, the street with the rails on it, and just basically picking people up at the streetcar stops who are waiting with the streetcars. And it's much faster because the cars can weave in and out of things on the road, where the streetcars tend to get stuck. And so he discovers that there is a legal loophole that allows him to do this, and the word starts to spread, and other people start to do this, and so these become known as jitney cars, because you ride in them for the usual price, but you're not going on the streetcar. And the streetcar companies start to go nuts about this, because there's fewer people going on the streetcars, and therefore they haven't got the revenue coming in, and so their revenues start to take a hit. They start to have to reduce frequency, and so this turns into a big legal fight about whether you're allowed to do this. But the funny thing is that the more newspaper coverage there was of this legal battle, the more people in other cities would read about it and go, you know what, that's a really good idea. I could do that too. And so throughout 1914 and 1915, this idea just spreads like wildfire across America, where you've got a lot of unemployed people, and some of those unemployed people own these cars, and sometimes they'll borrow one, and they start basically, it's a flexible, you can do it whenever you like. You can do it for a couple of hours in the middle of the day, or you might focus on a particular route. And in fact, some jitney drivers started to do things like, if there was a big ball game or something like that, they would hang around outside the stadium, or they would take people to it. And so they were much more flexible than the buses or the streetcar lines, which only ran on particular schedules to particular stops on particular routes. And so there was a lot to be said for this, because it was a much more flexible system. For a lot of people, it was the first time they would have ridden in a car altogether, because cars were still, relatively things that, you had to be relatively wealthy to afford. And so it introduced people to riding in cars. But anyway, inevitably, the streetcar companies and the licensed taxi cab companies and the bus companies which were starting to appear, are incensed about this, and they basically shut the whole thing down through legal means. They point out, as people pointed out with Uber and Lyft, that are you even insured if you're riding in a vehicle like this. It's not meant to, right? So they say it's unsafe. And on the flip side, the Jitney riders say, the Jitney drivers and riders say, well, hang on a minute, we're providing a more flexible service that people actually want. And if you weren't so inflexible, then maybe you'd have a better business. But essentially, the whole thing is shut down within 2 years. Nearly every city passes a law in the US banning this, and so the craze is shut down. But what's so funny is that it then comes back 100 years later in the form of Uber and Lyft. And the big difference, I think, is that the Jitney drivers they weren't organized, didn't have a union or any kind of representation, so they had no means of fighting the lawsuits. And so the various measures that were proposed, like you can be a Jitney driver, but you have to buy a special license and you have to buy it up front, and it costs like hundreds of dollars. So basically that was a way of saying we allow it, but in a way that no one is actually going to want to do it. There were all of these tactics that were used to say this isn't illegal, but we're going to basically price them out of off the streets. What we've seen with Uber and Lyft, of course, particularly with Uber, is it has such deep pockets that it can afford to fight lawsuits, and eventually it fights its way to a settlement in different cities, and you get different rules in different places. But Uber would argue that it's giving people opportunities to work when they want to, and flexible working, and its opponents would say yes, but is it safe? Are you paying your drivers enough? It's a very, very familiar sounding debate. But what I think is the sort of broader lesson in the history of transport is that what both of these models are doing, and what the shutting down of the Jitneys did, was it sort of shut down experimentation, exploring the space between public transport, which is cheaper, and you have less flexibility. You have to ride on the routes and at the times when it's available, and then private car ownership, which is much more expensive, but what you're basically buying when you buy a car is a very expensive option to travel wherever you like, whenever you like. It's just that, most of the time, most cars are unused. They're used 5% of the time. So most of the time you're not going to be using your car. And there is, it turns out, a massive amount of, space to explore in between. And this is what we're seeing now with things like ride hailing, but also with things like, dockless bike rental and scooters, and so on. That there's been this terrific amount of exploration of things that are not as cheap and not as inflexible as public transport, but not as expensive and flexible as a car. And I think that's a good thing, because I think we do need to explore that space, and we need to come up with things that are in that space, because public transport is very expensive to build. And I know that, the story in Seattle with the whole saga with the light rail light, which is beautiful, by the way. But and then the story for most people in much of America is that there isn't a lot of public transport. There's a lot of transit deserts and so on, and therefore you kind of have to own a car in order to live in much of the US, and which we recognise is unsustainable in a lot of different ways. So yeah, I think this exploration of this space in between is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one other story in that same chapter that really resonated with me was more of a success story about this ride sharing place, and this was the Montgomery buses. Now, we're all very familiar with the bus boycott in 1956, but what I wasn't familiar with was the kind of solution to it that actually explored some of these new transport paradigms. So talk to us a little bit about the Montgomery Improvement Association and
yes,
the roving
absolutely.
churches.
Yeah, so when they decided to do the bus boycott, of course, the problem with that was that people relied on the buses to get to work. And so if people taking part in the boycott were not going to take the buses, they were going to have to walk downtown. So what Martin Luther King did was he organized essentially a fleet of jitneys again. And also black taxi drivers agreed to take riders who were participating in the boycott and charge the streetcar flat rate fare. And so the idea was that the economic impact of the bus boycott on the lives of the people who were not using the buses would they'd be able to mitigate it by having these fleets. And several churches kind of essentially pooled vehicles. A lot of black drivers brought their own vehicle. This is what Martin Luther King did. So he had his own car, and he essentially drove it as a carpool vehicle. And they had this very organized system of carpools where they used the churches as stops, and they would put several people in a car and take them downtown so they could go to work. And this was one of the reasons that the bus boycott was able to succeed, because there was an alternative that was organized, so that black people who were boycotting the buses had other means of getting around. And once again, there was all of this attempts to shut it down on regulatory grounds. Was this were you insured? Weren't they operating an illegal taxi service? And they came up with some very creative solutions to. I mean, at one point, this unofficial fleet of vehicles, they managed to get insurance for it by going directly to insurance brokers, it was a cat and mouse fight over whether it could be shut down, and it looked like it was about to be shut down just at the point where the segregation of buses is finally overturned at a federal level. So that's it is an amazing story, and once again, it's this people coming up with flexible transport systems that are in between public transport and private car ownership, and also the logic of sharing vehicles. A lot of people commute in cars on their own, and that's kind of mad. And if you have a system that allows you to put more people in a vehicle, you have less traffic, and it's more efficient. And today we have things like ride-hailing apps that try to do that, but you can also, it turns out, do this in the 1950s by having people go to churches and using them as unofficial Jitney or Uber stops. So yes, there's another example of this that then connects more broadly to the civil rights movement.
Well, let's kind of rewind a little bit. I mean, I think it's really interesting to talk about that recent history, but I think it's also important. I think a big part of your book, it kind of delves down into that, the prehistory or the early history of automobile or car-like things, and going all the way back to the invention of the wheel. And one of the things I learned, which I hadn't imagined, I kind of imagined these wheels coming out and people using them for agriculture straight away. I guess I had the agriculture mind. You kind of throw it in the same basket as the agricultural revolution. But it was interesting to me that you pointed out that some of the earliest uses of wheeled vehicles were actually as mobile homes, not an RV, but an actual mobile home. So just talk to me there about that as people discovered the wheel or invented the wheel, how they experimented with different uses of it. They seem quite modern in a way, and not just that old image we have of cattle slogging through the mud with
No, exactly. It's very striking that the early history of the wheel, the invention of the wheel, which happens about 3600 BCE, and it was always assumed it was in Mesopotamia because the Mesopotamians invented so many other things like cities and writing and large scale beer production, which are all very important, obviously. But what seems to have happened, the earliest archaeological evidence is that the wheel was probably invented in Eastern Europe, and the earliest sort of surviving wheels we have as archaeological evidence are from that period. They're not, as people often think, a log where you sort of saw a slice off the end of it. There are big problems with that. Firstly, you get a very small wheel that crumbles straight away because of the grain structure. But secondly, the saw is a much harder thing to build than a wheel, because if you think about it, you have to be able to manipulate metal and make a sharp toothed thing. Saws are not invented until about 2,000 years after the wheel. So that is not, despite the opening sequence of the Flintstones, how wheels are made. So the first wheels were actually made with planks of wood, which you can make by splitting logs with chisels, and then the planks are collected together with battens, and then you chisel a circle out of that. And this is exactly what the earliest wheel we have, the Ljubljana wheel, which is from about 3500 BC. You can see it's made of 3 planks of wood. And what's interesting is that the idea does spread very quickly around the top of the Black Sea to Mesopotamia from Europe. But it does seem to be the idea that spreads and not the knowledge of making it. And if you think about it, there something like an agricultural technique or a metallurgical technique, you do need to learn directly from somebody how to do it. But if you see a wheeled vehicle, you can kind of go, oh yeah, you could do that. And you can take the idea somewhere else and say, hey, let's get some wood and let's make this thing. I've seen it. The idea is sort of there. Once you've seen it, you've got it, right? And so what's interesting is that the wheels made in Mesopotamia, they are made from planks, but they're made in a slightly different way. And the way the battens work, they have curved battens instead. So it looks very much like it's the idea that has been carried, and someone has described it, and someone else has then made their own version of a wheel that actually looks a bit different. But yes, in the middle, you get these wagon nomads around the steppes, the flat areas to the north of the Black Sea. And these original vehicles would have been very heavy, and they would have had these big, solid wheels, and they would not have been able to go very fast. And it wouldn't have been safe to take them very far away from rivers, because basically the more friction you get, the hotter things get, and so the wheels catch fire quite easily, and you need to be able to repair them. And so they would have used them in Europe to, and they didn't have steering. That was the other thing. So you could use them to move, produce and wood and things between the fields and the village along a straight track. That was probably how they were used in agriculture to begin with. And then the Mesopotamians used them primarily for sort of ceremonial purposes, essentially as a mobile platform for the king to view a battlefield, and we see these on the Royal Standard of Ur. We see kings standing in these sort of tall things, and then in the middle, yes, the steppe nomads of the Black Sea, north of the Black Sea, they were using them as mobile homes, and the fact that you can't steer them very easily doesn't matter when you're traversing big wide plains. It doesn't matter, you're going at walking pace, because you're following your herds around, and if you want to take your herds to a different grazing area, the ability to put your house on wheels was really useful, because you can basically move your village around with your herds, and you can follow where the grazing is. And so that's how they were used there as these mobile homes. And you also get these wagon graves arising at that time, where people are buried in graves with a wheel in each corner of the grave. And so the grave becomes itself a sort of celestial wagon to take them into the afterlife. But then the striking thing about all of this period is that there are other cultures that are aware of the wheel, like the Egyptians. They're next door to the Mesopotamians. They know that the Mesopotamians have got wheels. They borrow quite a lot of other ideas from the Mesopotamians. Writing is probably borrowed by the Greeks. That's the most likely explanation, and we know there was trade between them. But the Egyptians managed to build the pyramids without using wheels at all. They used the Nile to move large blocks of stone around, because that's much easier. They used rollers and sleds to move the blocks on land. And in fact, no wheeled vehicle existed at the time would have been able to cope with those enormous pieces of stone anyway. So the Egyptians were kind of looking at them at wheels and thought, well, we don't need this technology. And it's only when the war chariots invented about 1500 BC that the Egyptians, facing invasions from the Hittites, decide that they are interested in wheels, and they then become very, very good at building war chariots, which are these much lighter two-wheel vehicles with spoked wheels. And there's one in Tutankhamun's tomb that weighs 35 kilos, and it's a sort of Ferrari of its day. And what's striking about that period with the war chariot is that that's the point at which the status of the rider becomes sort of equated with the coolness of the vehicle. You are what you drive, and kings are the most awesome people, and therefore they must have the fastest vehicles. And so, the depiction of kings in Assyria and in Egypt smiting their enemies from chariots becomes very widespread. And then, the gods are also depicted riding chariots, because of course they must ride chariots, because the kings ride chariots. And so you get this period of, that's the point where the Egyptians suddenly see the point of the wheel. But then the war chariot itself becomes obsolete within, about 1,000 years. So the way I put it in the book is there's this rather bumpy road to the acceptance of the idea that the wheel and the wheeled vehicle is an awesome thing. We think it's obvious today because we live in a world that's completely shaped by wheeled vehicles, but that's only been the case for the last 200 years, and it's a relatively modern idea that the wheel is the greatest invention in history. For a long time, most people didn't go in wheeled vehicles, and so another way of putting it is that fish don't know what water is. So fish swim around in water all the time, and they don't realize that there's any other way of existing. It's not like we don't really notice that there's air there, right? And we live in a world today where everyone alive today has grown up in a world completely shaped by the car in particular. And we kind of take a whole load of things for granted, like you shouldn't stand in the middle of a road because if you might get run over, and if you do, it's your fault. I mean, that's that was not the case for most of history, that it was your responsibility not to be run over. But what I'm trying to do here is point out the water to the fish and say there are all of these aspects of modern life that have been shaped by wheeled vehicles in general and cars in particular. And if we are going to start unpicking the car from the fabric of civilization, then it's very useful to see how it was woven in.
It's interesting. One of the things that I found interesting about the book was this meme that the reason we have the driveways we have and the garages we have in our house today is obviously to do with the size of the car, which goes all the way back to the Roman roads and to the Roman roads. And so to unpick that a little bit, but I also thought, another thing that's interesting about the Romans was that they kind of disliked them so much, the wheeled vehicles. They were only allowed to come into the city under the cover of night. They were these shameful things that, like, they were just so inconvenient. And this is before
they were clogging up the roads. They were clogging up the road. So yes, Julius Caesar banned wheeled vehicles in the city of Rome during the day, unless they were carrying certain. The Vestal Virgins, I think, were allowed to go in, travel around. So basically, religious figures could. And then if you were moving stone that was to do with sort of official temple construction, you were also allowed to break the rules. But of course, the clever thing about it is that anyone who breaks the rules by trying to drive a carriage, or actually, they weren't carriages, they would have been wagons or carts at that point, in the city of Rome during the day, would have been doing it in broad daylight. So it would have been very obvious what they were doing. But yes, the main problem is that Rome, like cities of the essentially any time before before about the 1st century, were not built with vehicles in mind. And Pompeii is a lovely example. Pompeii is founded in the 6th century BC and becomes very popular with the Romans as a resort town in the 1st century AD, and the streets just aren't wide enough for 2 lanes of traffic for the most part. So they introduced this very elaborate one-way system, which is just like the one in Manhattan, where you have the alternating eastward and westward streets. And and it's the same in Rome itself, that the streets are not built for vehicles, and so if you have vehicles, they really clog things up, and so they therefore try to limit it to night. And we know that this rule persisted for at least a century, because there are complaints in poetry from the 1st century AD about the noise of the wagons, moving stuff around at night, because that's when it all had to be done. So yes, there are. There are again these sort of strange rules that go back a long way, and also these strange parallels with things like one-way systems. But yes, the meme you referred to is this idea that the booster rockets as the solid fuel boosters of the space shuttle, they were sized according to what you could fit through a railway tunnel, and that depends in turn on the railway gauge, and that in turn goes back to the Roman decision to fix the railway gauge at a particular size because of the ruts in the roads in Pompeii is the meme. So the idea is that in Britain, we continue to use the Roman standard. And then when railways were invented, we use that as the railway gauge. And then that's imported to America. And then that ends up specifying all these other things. And it's basically not true. I mean, there's a germ of truth in it, but there wasn't actually a standard gauge for Roman carts, or indeed for English railways, or indeed American railways. I mean, there were lots of different attempts. And the ruts in the roads in Pompeii are very wide, and they actually support quite a wide variation in. So basically, yes, it is true that most wheels, for most of history, wheels have been about 1.4 meters apart, between 1.4 and kind of 1.5, 1.6, that kind of thing. Because yes, that is roughly the size of a horse, and the horse's rear end. But the idea that this was a sort of Roman standard that then hung on because the Roman roads remained in constant use in Europe, and therefore we all kind of kept the idea that it's a path dependency, and it's that's just not true, because actually the Roman road system did fall out of use for quite a long time. Those ruts in the road, you just get them in some places, so it wasn't that people were still building. And within Britain, you can see that there were standard gauges for agricultural carts that vary quite widely around the country. So yeah, the idea that sort of standard was chosen by the Romans and has there's a clear line of descent all the way from the space shuttle booster rockets and American railways back to that is an urban myth. And there are quite a lot of these, quite a lot of urban myths that need puncturing, and so in the history of transport. And it's also an enormous amount of kind of appropriate enough of path dependency in the history of transport. So a decision that is made at some point does end up, so why are traffic lights red and green? I mean, that goes back to railways used red and green, although they originally used red and white, and that in turn, those colours were borrowed from shipping. And it was the construction of a lighthouse in the early 19th century where it was another lighthouse nearby, so they had to use a separate colour, so they decided to use red. And so the idea of red as a warning light that is then used in a nautical sense stems from that, and then that has ended up giving us our red traffic lights today. So yeah, there are some of these strange lineages, but we have to distinguish the real ones from the urban myths.
Right, and it's easy when you look back at some of these old technologies. You kind of you look at them through the modern eye. So jumping forward quite a few centuries, I thought one of the illustrations in the book that struck me was in 1770s, the London steam carriage. And this was a steam-powered vehicle. And to my eyes, it's recognizably a car, right? It has a driver with some sort of steering mechanism sitting towards the front of the vehicle. It has four wheels. And it's got this massive, great big steam engine that's doing the work. But I mean, is that me making a mistake? Is that my prejudices? Because obviously it handled nothing like a car. It didn't have the infrastructure. Talk to me how that kind of settled out at that time when we didn't know at that point. We didn't know even for 100 years after that whether it was going to be steam, internal combustion, or other motive power.
Yeah.
That would be the.
Yeah, well, so exactly. So things. What's really striking is that you've basically got these wooden things that are pulled by horses that have four wheels that you sit on, and they are. If you look at a carriage in 1750, it's not that different from a Roman one. It has basically suspension and steering and things like that. It might have, the more recent one might have fancier seats and it might have glass windows, but it's surprising how little that technology has changed over thousands of years. And then you get this incredible change in the 19th century where transport technology just goes kaboom. I mean, it just, it takes off and you get all of these new things. And it starts with the steam engine. And of course, steam engines are originally built to pump water out of mines. And the first steam engines are very, very big. They're the size of a house. But gradually people figure out how to make them smaller and more efficient. And then by about the 1760s, it's feasible to actually put one on a vehicle and power it. And there's a Frenchman who does this. Actually, I think he's Swiss, but he tries to build a steam, what we would now call a traction engine, to pull large cannons for the French army. And it's not a success. It's very, very difficult to steer because the steam engine is actually mounted on the front wheel of the vehicle. So to turn the front wheel, you actually have to move the engine, which is incredibly heavy. And so it's very hard to steer and it's very hard to stop, and it crashes almost immediately, at which point the government, pulled its funding. But people kept having a go at this. And so, yes, you do get these vehicles built around the turn of the, around 1800. And this London steam carriage is one of them. Puffing Devil is another. And essentially they are what we would now call traction engines. So they are steam powered vehicles. They're a bit smaller. They still have steering problems. So the London steam carriage also crashed into a wall. And they were very, very heavy. And so they really tore up the roads because the roads were, if they were paved, then having a lot of them weren't paved, but even if they were, then having something that heavy going over them, particularly when it went round corners. I mean, we see this now. If you have a tank driving on public roads and it does a sharp turn, it will just completely carve up the roads. So that was the big problem, and they were hard to control, and they messed up the roads, and people were terrified of them. And so the insight at the beginning of the 19th century was that the best thing to do was put them on rails, because then you don't have the steering problem, because they've just got the rails. And then you don't have the tearing up the roads problem. And so that leads to the steam engine and the steam railway boom of the mid 19th century. And you get railways built in Britain and then in other countries around the world. And of course, these are vehicles that can go much faster than anything has been able to go before. Previously, you've been limited by how fast a horse could travel, basically, with either pulling a cart or with you riding on the back of it. And suddenly you can go much faster than that. And then the other big innovation you get in the 19th century is the invention of the bicycle. And the bicycle's interesting because there's no real reason why you couldn't. The first bicycles have basically wooden wheels. They don't have things like rubber tires and spoked wheels, and all of that stuff comes later. So the actual first bicycles, you could have built one earlier. There's famously that picture of a bicycle in Leonardo's notebook. It is a fake. It was added in the 1960s. It shows things like pedals and spoked wheels, which weren't invented until at least the 1860s. But if you look at the first bicycles, which are called Draceens, and they're a bit like the bikes that we give children now to learn to ride. So they don't have pedals. These days we teach children how to balance first, then we teach them how to pedal later. Whereas when you and I learned to ride bikes, we were given bikes with pedals and we had to learn everything in one go. But essentially the first bicycles look like those kids' balance bikes. And the guy invents them, Von Drees. He builds it around 1815, 1816. And gradually over the course of the 19th century, they get refined and people realize that you can put pedals on them and you get the tricycle, and then you get spoked wheels, and you get brakes, and so on and so on and so on. So you end up with these two very, very interesting forms of transport that are not horse-drawn things on roads, one of which is very, very fast. and very powerful. And then one of which is very, very personal. It lets you go anywhere on any road and is much less expensive than owning a horse, and has, it has this enormous emancipating effect that it allows people to, broaden their social circles. It gives people a lot more freedom to travel around without having to walk, without the expense of owning a horse and so on. And what's interesting is by the end of the 19th century, people are saying, well, is there a way that we could have a mode of transport that could go anywhere, like a bicycle or a horse, but could go as fast as a train, but would be as cheap to own and as flexible as a bicycle. And of course, that's what the automobile delivers on. And in the first years of the automobile, there are steam-powered vehicles, there are petrol ones, there are electric ones. And in fact, in the 1890s in America, they're all selling in roughly equal quantities. And the best-selling car in the US in 1897 is an electric car. But then ultimately the petrol engine does win, and that then sets the, by the early 20th century, we're off to the races, and it's all petrol cars all the time. But there were electric cars, and they were a surprisingly large proportion of cars being sold back in the day. But the problem, as always, was the batteries. The batteries were crap.
Let's go. I'm keen to get to some audience questions. I want to get one more anecdote that I really want. One more story, which is just a lovely story, and that's Bertha Benz. Bertha Benz, the wife of Carl Benz, obviously automotive pioneer. But I think it encapsulates both the overlooked role of women in automotive design and also the introduction of the very modern concept of the road trip. And tell me a little bit about Bertha.
Yes, so the internal combustion engine is invented in the middle of the 19th century, initially to power machinery in factories, and then it's small enough and people realize you could put it on vehicles. And what Carl Benz does that's significant, that's why he's recognized as the creator of the first modern automobile, is that instead of just attaching it to an existing vehicle like a bicycle or a wagon, he builds an entirely new vehicle around the engine. And we would look at it today and it looks like a tricycle. I mean, it is a tricycle. It's got two big back wheels. It's got a single front wheel, rather like the London steam carriage, but it's much, much lighter. It's built out of bicycle parts. So, the bicycle is actually more the car is the successor to the bicycle, not the train. It's not a train that goes on roads. It's really a bicycle that has an engine. And he builds this first prototype in 1886, and Bertha Benz is very closely involved in it. She helps him test it. She actually funds its development, and they drive it around in the yard outside their house. And he's still refining it 2 years later, and she thinks that it's ready to be taken out into the world, and he needs to show people what he's come up with. And he's like, no, I need to refine it some more. I've still got more work to do. So one morning she gets her teenage sons out of bed and she says, right, we're going to see my mother. And she basically takes the prototype car. She sticks her kids it's got one seat, and she drives to see her mum, who lives 65 miles away. So this is the world's first road trip, and the modern concept of the road trip. Now you may say, well, how does she refill the car? Because there's no filling stations. Like, you can't buy gasoline by the road, but you could, because at the time petroleum spirit was sold as a household solvent, as a cleaning agent. You could buy it in pharmacies, and in fact the pharmacy where she stops to fill up the car is now got a sign on the wall outside saying that it's the first filling station in the world, because it's where the first time someone filled up a car. But anyway, yes, she drives across country in this car, terrifying the farmers who are like, what the hell is this? One of the reasons she takes the boys is that the gears aren't very good for going uphill, so steeper hills you have to get out and push. She goes to see her mum, and she telegraphs her husband when she gets there and says, I've taken the car and we've gone to see my mum, back in a few days. And then a few days later she drives back again, and on the way back she has to do, she decides that the brake pads are wearing thin, so she stops at a cobbler's and has him add an extra layer of leather to the brake pads. And anyway, she gets back again and says, look, this car worked perfectly well. They're not calling it cars, of course. The motorwagen works perfectly well. I've got some suggestions on how you can improve the gears and the brake pads, but essentially I think it's ready to go. So her husband then has the confidence to take it to an industrial exhibition and show it, and he wins the gold medal for the greatest innovation. And then that's the beginning of cars being sold and the commercialization of the automobile. So Bertha Benz plays this absolutely crucial role by showing that it's a useful thing, and going on the first road trip to see her mum. So next time you go on a road trip to see your mum, you're following in a great tradition.
It's a lovely story, isn't it? It's a lovely story. All right, I want to start getting some audience questions now. And let's start with this one is kind of looking into the future. We've done a lot of stuff in the past. So here's 2 questions I'm kind of sticking together. Your book is entitled From the Wheel to the Car to What Comes Next. So what comes next? What's the next best way of transportation? Will it be in our lifetime or is it beyond us? And I'm going to wrap that in with another question, which is, given your admiration for the wheel and the history of transportation, what's your opinion on self-driving cars?
Right, something we're both very interested in. Yeah. So so the striking thing is that you have this period of basically horse-drawn transport, and then you have the 20th century where the car becomes the dominant means of transport. And so, what comes after that? And I think now is a very interesting time to ask that, because we are at a juncture now in the 2020s that's very similar to where we were in the 1890s. And the 1890s is the point where the unsustainability of horse-drawn transport has become apparent. In big cities like London and New York, there's just horse manure everywhere, and the horse population is growing faster than the human population. So the number of horses you need per person is going up very quickly. And that's clearly unsustainable, because there's nowhere to put the horses. You've got the horse manure everywhere, which no one wants to use as fertilizer anymore because they've discovered guano. And so you've got these health problems, you've got traffic, you've got congestion, you've got noise. And so there's a recognition in the 1890s that something's got to change, but they're not quite sure what. And then, of course, the advocates of the car say, well, hang on a minute, we've got this technology over here. So we're in a similar situation today. We've recognized that car ownership on the scale that we have it in the US and in Europe is unsustainable. And you can't have everyone in the world owning cars at that level. In fact, it's, the level that we own them now is unsustainable because of the exhaust. It's not horse manure, it's the invisible carbon dioxide that's, and the particulates, but particularly the carbon dioxide and the climate consequences of that. So we are at this very analogous point where we're saying, we need to change. What do we switch to? And back in the 1890s, you had people saying, "Hey, what about these steam powered cars, or these electric cars, or these petrol powered cars? Or what about there is actually an attempt to build an electric kind of car sharing taxi system, and there's an attempt to build a monopoly." It's another story that's very, very like Uber. The idea that streetcar monopolies would own monopolies of electric taxi fleets in New York and in other cities. So there are lots of ideas being tossed around, and we see exactly the same thing today. We see all of this innovation in micromobility, so scooters and dockless bike rental and docked bike rental, and other things like that. And then we also have obviously ride hailing, which has been a big thing for the past few years. And then the use of public transport has become a lot more attractive because our smartphones can show us when the next bus or train is going to arrive. And that makes public transport much easier to use, much easier to navigate. Is there a bus that takes me from here to where I want to go? Oh, there is. And there's one arriving in 5 minutes over the road. It's transformative. So what I think comes next is what I call the Internet of Motion, which is where we use the smartphone to knit together all of these other transport things, public transport, ride hailing, micromobility, and then we can stitch into that as new technologies emerge, like autonomous cars if we can get them to work, and flying cars as people working on those, and who knows what else is coming. But if we have this much more sort of diverse ecosystem of transport, diverse fabric of different methods of transport woven together by the phone, then we won't make the mistake that we made in the 20th century of allowing one kind of transport to really bend our cities and our lives out of shape and really influence so many aspects of our lives that we're like the fish swimming in the sea. We can't see them. We don't realize that we have supermarkets because we have cars. Supermarkets only make sense if you have cars. So the answer to what comes next, I think, is this what the jargon for it in the industry is mobility as a service, which no human will ever say. So I call it Internet of Motion, but other people call it the trip economy. There's lots of things you could call it. And in a sense, it means that what comes after the car is the cell phone, because the cell phone gives you the freedom to travel, the freedom to shop, the freedom to socialize that the car used to give people. So teenagers, the technology that defines you is your phone. It used to be your car, but now it's your phone, and your phone is the means of self-expression, of socializing, of shopping, of ordering food, of doing all of those things. So yeah, it's the Internet of Motion stitched together by the phone. And on the autonomous cars, I mean, we've both been researching them, writing about them for a long time, and we may be able to get them to work eventually, but the problem is that they work sort of 96% of the time, and it's that last 4% that is really, really hard and makes them not safe to deploy in large numbers. And my suspicion is that the way we'll see the deployment of autonomous vehicles at scale first is most likely to be in China, where you can have, the city authorities will say, we are closing the streets in this district to everything except autonomous cars. You're not allowed to be a pedestrian, or if you are, you have to walk on these walkways. And basically, the way this is classic. If you can't solve the problem, redefine the problem, right? Make it easier. And I think moving the goalposts. I mean, it's just the autonomous vehicle startups in America are trying to solve this very difficult problem of making a vehicle that you can drop into existing cities and existing traffic flows without any modification. And that is really, really hard. And, they've done an amazing job of solving 96% of the problem, but that last bit is very difficult. So I think that problem will eventually be solved, and we will see them used in, some circumstances, whether they'll be, the grand claims that this will abolish car ownership and so on. I think, that's, as I explained in the book, those grand claims made about AVs that they will fix congestion and fix accidents and so on are exactly the sort of utopian claims that were made about automobiles in the 1890s and 1900s and turned out not to be true. And I think that's a warning that we need to take those sorts of predictions with a pinch of salt.
I mean, for your Internet of Motion, do you have any concerns that by having this internet, this single this single window to explore your transportation options, you're merely creating another monopoly that can have unintended consequences, such as the ones we saw with when everyone
the area where I'm most worried about that, because it is stitching together. So my phone can stitch together Google Maps can stitch together whatever transport systems are around, and Google is not, Google has Waymo, but I mean, Google is not, those transport systems don't need to be owned by the people who make the app. So, right. And then Uber's business model is explicitly that they want to be the portal through which you buy your transport. And they'll provide some of it themselves, but they also want you to be able to buy, tickets for public transport. And their dream is, you say, I want to go from here to here. And they say, well, go to the bottom of the road and get this bus, and then it will take you to the station, and then you can get a train. And then when you get off, there'll be an Uber waiting for you to take you the last miles to the place where the public transport doesn't reach, or whatever. So I'm not worried about that. The thing that, because I think, you can use apps to stitch, like the internet. I mean, there isn't a single company that owns the infrastructure of the internet. But I think the lesson of history is that what's always caught us out is the exhaust. So it was the horse manure with the horses, and it was the CO2 with the cars, and the exhaust from the Internet of Motion is the data about your travel behavior. And you can imagine that, authoritarian governments can, basically track where everyone's going, or stop some people going to some place. You could have segregation, you could say, and you have this in China, right? If you offend the government, by writing something on social media that they don't like, they can take away your right to travel on high-speed trains and domestic flights. So there is this, means of social control through transport. Some people I've spoken to have said we're going to need net neutrality for roads. So that's where, and there's been this fight with the system that the LA Department of Transport developed called MDS, which is supposed to be a data sharing scheme between micro mobility providers and the city government, which kind of makes sense because, you can see why both would want to be able to exchange data, but there have been concerns that data is not being held securely enough. The ACLU and the EFF have, filed a lawsuit against it, and lots of other cities in the US are using it. So I think we have to tread carefully on that front, because, potentially real-time access of data to, who's where, and if that's not held securely, et cetera, there need to be proper safeguards around this sort of thing.
Jumping as topics a little bit, what's the future of transportation safety, right? We saw, it's interesting in the pandemic, we all know that people drove less, and yet
more people died on the roads,
more
right?
people are dying, right? It's gone up by, the miles decreased 13%, and yet it's up, from 3,000, more people are dying.
It's extraordinary, and it seems to be that in the US people were basically driving faster because the roads were emptier, and then because they were going faster they couldn't stop, and then it seems to be there's fairly good data on that. So I think the astonishing thing is we'll look back on the era of widespread car ownership, and I think we will be amazed at the level of death we were prepared to tolerate. More people have died in in cars in the US since 2000, about 650,000 people, which is more Americans died in all the wars of the 20th century put together. And in fact, all previous wars, foreign wars fought by America. And obviously the coronavirus has killed about 680,000 people in America. In fact, we think it's about 850,000 based on excess deaths at The Economist. But that's an enormous death toll, but and obviously in a much shorter period of time. But essentially, cars have killed the same number of people as COVID in the past 20 years as opposed to the past 2 years. And it's surprising that we sort of accept this as a fact of life. And there are some very interesting things that some cities have been doing, like Oslo and Helsinki, where they do restrict car access in the centre of the city. They pedestrianise a lot more areas. They subsidise public transport in a big way, and they had 0 road deaths in 2019. Both of those cities. So there are things you can do that make cities much more pleasant and much safer. And what's been really interesting about the last couple of years has been that during the pandemic, obviously a lot of cities have been willing to experiment with street layouts and different ways of allocating space and more bike lanes and things like that. And I think that's given a lot of people around the world a glimpse of what what cities might look like if we had fewer cars and we had other options and other ways of getting around. Now it sounds like I'm predicting the end of the car. I'm not. There is evidence that even in America, people are using cars less than they were. So the number of miles being driven each year is growing more slowly than the number of vehicles or the number of people. So I think there is good evidence that we've passed peak car, but that's not to say that cars will go away. I mean, horses haven't gone away. The broad trend is that the ownership of a car is becoming more inconvenient and more costly, and the alternatives to owning a car are becoming more convenient and less costly. So at the margin, you are seeing younger people learning to drive later or not at all, and you are seeing people who live in cities, and most people in the world now live in cities, are increasingly able to get away with not owning a car. I think that does suggest that we are in a position to move towards a less car dependent model. And what's particularly illustrative in this case is what's happened in China, where you've had enormous growth and you've got a very, very large urbanized population and a much lower level of car use because ride hailing is so massive. I mean, Didi in China is bigger than Uber in the rest of the world put together. I mean, it's just enormous. To an engineer's approximation, ride hailing is a Chinese phenomenon. And that has allowed an entire generation of urbanites in China to skip car ownership completely. It's much, it's not considered a mandatory in the way that it is in the West.
Yeah, I mean, and in the West, particularly here in America, car ownership and transportation seems to be, and yet another one of the things that becomes a political issue, doesn't it? I mean, it's you've heard of the phenomenon of coal rolling, right? Where people are deliberately modifying their trucks to emit more fumes and more particulates, just because it's a kind of a middle finger to what they perceive the politically correct, the electric vehicles, who which also get disproportionate amount of people harassing them. So that's kind of, I'm interested to hear whether you think that's going to become really stratified and really entrenched, or do you feel like these innovations in transportation can break through? So some of these older attitudes, some of these other attitudes. Yeah,
well, I mean, it does tend to be older people who are obsessed with, I'm never going to buy an electric car because there's nothing like the sound of a V8. And, I do recognize that. And I've been obsessed with cars since I was little, and supercars are awesome and all the rest of it. Most people don't drive supercars. But the funny thing is, I think that the perception is shifting. I mean, if you're really into performance, then you probably want to be looking at electric cars now. I mean, the superest supercars are hybrids at least, and some of them are pure electric. And the Tesla really did move the perception of whether electric cars before the Tesla were kind of crappy, had bad batteries, looked really weird, and kind of were driven by weirdos. That was the kind of perception that people had of them. There's been prejudice against electric cars. It goes back to, in fact, a century ago when electric cars were sold as women's cars. because they were designed for people who were weak, as women were not strong enough to turn the starting handle, and they weren't clever enough to be mechanics who could maintain their own cars. And so obviously electric cars were, no man would want to drive one, but they were ideal for women. And that was how that's how they were sold. And also, Henry Ford buys his wife an electric car because men who were buying a car for their wives wanted to limit their freedom in some cases. And an electric car definitely limited how far you could go because you had to turn around before the battery runs out. Whereas, petrol cars were manly freedom machines that you could, set off on adventures with, but you couldn't do that with electric cars. So, and that was true for the whole 20th century because the battery technology was terrible. And then we get these much better batteries because of camcorders and laptops. And then two nutters in California stuck 7,000 camcorder batteries into a car and made the T0, which is essentially the car that inspired the founders of Tesla. And then the whole Tesla model where you start with the Roadster, with the high performance car, and then you work your way down, which is what they're gradually doing. I really think that has changed perceptions, that electric cars don't have to be terrible. They can actually accelerate really fast. I mean, driving an electric car is actually really fun because you have this sort of guilt-free acceleration. So yeah, I think that is just a largely demographic thing, and I understand where people are coming from, and I think there will still be, in the same way that horse racing and doing things with horses on the weekend is a hobby that some rich people still have. I think driving internal combustion engine cars, probably running on synthetic fuels, is still going to be happening in the mid to late 21st century. But I think it's, generally I think it's a generational shift. And I think, young people are much more concerned about the environment and recognize that we do need to change the way we do not just transport, but a whole load of other aspects of modern life to make them more sustainable.
Well, this has been fantastic, Tom. I'm just going to finish with a couple of questions from the audience about your book, the book itself. And I think they're kind of interesting because they kind of go to what some of the things you've been talking about. One of them is, why did you choose the word motion, the brief history of motion, for the book title? Do you find it's an umbrella term that allows you to bring in audiences? And the other one is very specifically asking, have you experienced anyone assuming your book is just for car lovers? And, what's the best way to get more people interested in this?
That's a good point. So the title of the book was suggested by my editor, and it's essentially a sort of publishing joke because Stephen Hawking wrote that book, A Brief History of Time, and so he thought, why not have a brief history of motion? Because I told him what I wanted to do, which was essentially a social history of the car, but I wanted to look at the origins of what happened, why did cars take off, and so you have to look at the prehistory of the car and so on. So and a brief history of wheeled transport doesn't really trip off the tongue. So it's true it doesn't do all kinds of motion. So there's nothing about aeroplanes or shipping in here. So some people have sort of said, well, this is this book doesn't do what it says on the tin. So that the subtitle is having to explain this is actually about wheels and cars and what comes next. So that's the answer to that question. And then the other question is, I've tried to write this book in a way that is not. There are lots of books that are attacks on the car, and the car is terrible, and there are books like that. And then there are other books that are a kind of riposte to that say, well, actually cars are great, and people who attack cars don't understand the importance of car culture. And I'm kind of in the middle because I was obsessed with cars from a young age, and I love being able to, when I see it. I saw a DeLorean, I was driving the other day, I saw a DeLorean go past on the M1, and I was like, wow, there are still DeLoreans that are actually working, So I get a thrill from stupid things like that, because I'm a nerd. But at the same time, I recognize, as a tech writer, that cars, have bent the world out of shape and are unsustainable in lots of ways, both environmentally and then do road safety and then et cetera, et cetera. And I think we're, even car owners recognize this, because when you're in your car, pedestrians are, oh no, I've got to stop for a pedestrian crossing. How annoying! And when you're a pedestrian, the cars are annoying, right? And we kind of we put on both of those personas, and we recognize that we have this sort of split personality about being motorists some of the time and not being motorists some of the time. So I've tried to write the book in an even-handed way that just says, look, folks, this is what happened, and these were its consequences, and we can probably learn some lessons from that. And it's not meant to be an attack on the car or a defense of the car in particular. But in fact, if you look at all my books, they tend to have they tend to be about a geeky thing of aspect of history and how it has changed the way that we live today. And what that means is that I'm effectively building a bridge between the community of people who think that geeky thing is the most important thing in the world. And what I give them is the the evidence that they need to argue that their hobby is in fact the most important thing in the world. So my drinks book, for example, it's like I'm a coffee fiend. So I've read this book and it tells me how I can explain to people how important coffee is in history. So that core audience is given the sort of broader context for why their particular interest is so important. And then the general audience get something different out of the book, which is that they understand why this thing that they always thought was quite nerdy is in fact important and has shaped their world in ways that they didn't realize. So what I'm always doing with my books is I'm building a bridge between the general audience and the specialist audience, and sort of helping them, connect and communicate with each other. The drinks book did this beautifully because, it's on the AP World History curriculum, because you can get teenagers to read about world history if you tell them it's all about drinking. But then I've had so many people say to me that they bought that book, my dad's really into whiskey or my dad's really into beer, and I bought him that book because now it was a way for us to talk about that subject. So that's what I'm trying to do in this case with cars as well. I hope it appeals to people who are interested in cars. It's not a comprehensive history of cars. There's nothing about Formula One racing or NASCAR or other kinds of there's very little of that. And some reviewers have said they think it's I don't sound enthusiastic enough about the thrill of driving and things like that. But it's not aimed at car lovers specifically. It's aimed at a broad audience that includes car lovers. So I hope they connect in that way.
I think they should. I think it's it's actually a cracking read. And I know I count myself as a transportation journalist, and I learned a lot. But I had a lot of laughs, so it was great. But I do, talking of which, I want to end, we're kind of running out of time. We're not on a hard deadline, but we are running out of time. But I wanted to end on one question, which I thought was great. And I'm sure you've got all manner of anecdotes. And the question is, how important was shock absorbers or any kind of spring chassis absorption in the development of vehicles before and after automobiles? Basically, how important was it that our bums were comfy in the process of getting from A to B?
Well, this was one of the problems with the steam vehicles, that they didn't have suspension, and you could put suspension on. So the wagons have got 4 wheels, carts have got 2. Wagons with steering is a roughly Roman period, and then you start to get suspension after that, and you have the whole rise of the coach and sort of comfort. Vehicles that are more comfortable. The big problem was it wasn't just that the roads. The big problem was the roads weren't paved and they were very uneven. So if you took a stagecoach from London to somewhere outside London, it was basically no faster than walking, and it would probably overturn a couple of times on the journey. So it wasn't just the case that the roads were slightly bumpy. In many cases, the roads were sort of impenetrable swamps. So it's more later on when you have vehicles going on roads that if you're going to ride them for a long time, then yes, then suspension becomes more important. There's not a huge amount about the technology of suspension or steering in this book, though. I don't think it's more about the sort of the social impact of it. But yeah, you do get. It becomes more tolerable to ride these vehicles for long periods when you add suspension to them. That's certainly the case.
One of the facts there that kind of joined some dots for me was the idea that the bicycle literally paved the way for the car.
Yes.
Because cycling became important and people wanted smooth roads, and so they insisted on those. And
but they also wanted the right to ride the bicycles in places like Central Park. And at the time, Central Park was essentially for rich people to swan around in their carriages and show off to each other. And this was an idea borrowed from Europe, where big cities in Hyde Park in London and similarly there's a park in Paris and there's another one in Florence, which is the original one, where the rich would swan around in their carriages, and it was a sort of look at me, here I am in my carriage. And so the really important thing is when the cyclists start to demand the rights to take their new vehicles into these other places, and they win that, and that sets the precedent that new kinds of vehicles that these roads aren't just for fancy carriages, and that then literally opens the way for the car. And then the fact that the road paving is improving for cyclists is also part of that. So yes, the way that the bike kind of prepares the way for the car is really quite striking. And then, the use of bicycle components in the first Benz Motorwagen, it is very striking. And this is something that cycling historians are aware of and constantly go on about. There's a very good book called Roads Were Not Made for Cars, which is a sort of polemic in favor of how we made a terrible mistake. And I think you can make that argument that there ought to be more emphasis on cycling. And we have seen one. Lots and lots of cities have added cycle lanes in the past 2 years, and they've said that they're going to make them permanent. So I think that's a good thing.
Well, Tom, look, thanks for joining us in the middle of the night. It's been, I've really enjoyed it, and I'm sure by the number of questions we've had coming in, I think our audience has enjoyed it too. You won't do it, so I'm going to hold up a copy of his book. It might be back in front. That's not going to help. Anyway, I thought it was a really good read, and I'm getting no commission for this, so go and buy a copy.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Mark, thank you for leading that discussion. And Tom, thank you for staying up late with us here in Seattle and sharing your nerding out of this topic. I think it's really inviting to kind of bring it in that way rather than this is about cars, because it's more than that. It's about the history and the origins. So thank you for just being with us tonight.
Thank you very much.
Yes, and remember to our audience at home to buy a copy from our friends over at Third Place Books, and that link can be found in the chat. And both of you, thank you so much, and everyone here and wherever you may be, have a good night.
Thank you for listening to Town Hall Seattle's Civic Series. I'm your producer, Ginny Palmer. Our theme music comes from the Seattle-based band Ibu and Seattle's own Barsuk Records. If you haven't listened yet, Town Hall's original podcast, In the Moment, features exclusive interviews between authors, artists, and experts, and a rotating cast of Seattle correspondents in conversation with them. If you like our Civic series, listen to our Arts and Culture and Science podcast series as well. To support our programs and institution, make a donation online or join Town Hall as a member. For more information, go to our website at townhallseattle.org. Thank you for listening to our Town Hall Seattle Civic Series.